sci-fi, fantasy, two monolithics of the booktube community, I would say. Let's talk about what they are and try to define them. Welcome, I am Pete. This is the Ponderings of Pete. Thank you so much for tuning in. Like, this is a radio broadcast or something, but it's really not, because you can see my face. If you are new here, I appreciate you, clicking on the video and being like, oh, this looks interesting. If you want, there's a subscribe button down below, if I can say it correctly. And there's also a bell notification down there below as well to hit the bell and then hit all. That'll notify you of all of my videos that pop up. There's also a like button if you would like to hit that. And then if you have thoughts, please comment down below. I enjoy listening to what other people have to say, especially on a nuanced topic such as this, because I've come across a lot of different opinions about what fantasy and sci-fi are, and needless to say, I don't agree with all of them. So, if you have thoughts on something I said, if you have a definition that you'd like to put forth, please let me know. I think, discourse is valuable, especially when we can have discourse without vitriol, without anger, despite maybe disagreeing with each other. Respectful, loving discourse. And if you are returning, again, please, same thing I said earlier, comment down below. I really enjoy hearing all of your thoughts on some of my previous videos, and just continue to pour in the comments. Because, again, interaction, I love it. Like, that's why I'm here on YouTube, is to interact with people that I wouldn't necessarily interact in my day-to-day life, because you don't live around me, with some few exceptions. That being said, let's talk about why you came here, which is fantasy and sci-fi. What are they? This is my attempt to roughly define both of these as genres in literature. I'm mostly going to stick to books. There's one exception that I'm going to tell you what it is later on, but it's books and movies, so it is what it is. But for the most part, I will be sticking to books. I do want to preface this is my opinion, if you couldn't tell. This is something that is formulated over the years of me just hearing random comments and thinking and pondering just what are these two genres, because I do think they are different genres. I do think that there are specific things that are different. There will be exception to these, because literature is an art, and fantasy and sci-fi are literature. So, being an art, there is almost nothing objective, ? There a lot of art is very subjective, and genres I don't think are an exception, because of a lot of different reasons, whether it being marketing people being stupid or other people just coming up with different definitions and throwing them in the mix. There is no hard and fast rule, because there just isn't. So when I talk about definitions, and if I happen to use absolute terms, it is because that in my experience that has been true. It doesn't necessarily mean it is always true, because books definitely break these boundaries all the time. And I may mention some of them. So let's talk about fantasy and sci-fi. So what is sci-fi and fantasy? I think there's a lot of definitely misconceptions, and some of that is fueled by marketing, because marketing is annoying. Marketing likes to shove everything down and generalize it as much as possible in order to appeal to a wide swath of people. So to marketing, sci-fi might be, ooh, space. Fantasy might be, ooh, dragons, mythical creatures, magic. But that's not necessarily what it is, because there are books that bend that, like Dragon Riders of Pern, which is technically a sci-fi, but hey, there's dragons. Or something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I'll use for a few examples, which it's sci-fi, but there's no space. But I'll get back to that. The main difference between sci-fi is not, say, like boots on the ground, or versus flying up high in the sky, or dragons versus spaceships, but in my opinion, the difference between fantasy and sci-fi is really placement, like the primary difference. Where is it happening in relation to the reader? Both fantasy and sci-fi can be grouped under what is called speculative fiction, where it's just like these big what-if questions. Fantasy and sci-fi do tend to go in different directions. Though you could also argue that a lot of fantasy and sci-fi go similar ways with like adventure fiction, essentially, nowadays, more than them being close to what they used to be originally. So let's start with sci-fi. What is it? Let's start with talking about what sci-fi is not. Some of these are simply statements that I've heard people say that have either frustrated me or been like, you're not completely correct, or just like, this is needlessly reductive. And the first one being sci-fi equals space. This is probably the most, if I'll say, the most wrong out of all these statements, and the most reductive. This is mostly the marketing thing, that sci-fi equals space. That eliminates so much sci-fi as sci-fi that is great sci-fi. Like, if you look into great sci-fi novels, Frankenstein, there's no space in it. That's literally the first sci-fi novel to exist. Not the first work of sci-fi, but the first sci-fi novel. And there's no space. It's literally just about a dude deciding to play with dead bodies. Is there a lot of space in sci-fi? Yes, but that is a consequence of what sci-fi is, not a monolithic, singular attribute that can define it. Sci-fi is so much more than just space. Also, if you simply call your book sci-fi because it is in space, I do think that's a misclassification, because there's more that you need to look into than just, oh, it has space. Do you actually delve into thematic elements? Like, are you talking about the implications of like what the space travel is, or whatever? Just there's sci-fi explores so much more than just, oh, we're in space. You could fully have fantasy in space. You can fully have mystery thrillers in space, but it doesn't make it sci-fi. It just makes it have maybe sci-fi influences. Other examples of sci-fi that aren't in space, a lot of Jules Verne's stuff, whether it's Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, that all could be considered sci-fi. No space. I mean, Around the World in 80 Days might come close, because they're in a balloon and they go up pretty high at some point. H.G. Wells as well. The Invisible Man. Time Machine. I don't think Time Machine goes in space. War of the Worlds. There's aliens, but there's no space. There's aliens from space, though. The next one is futuristic. So a lot of people say that if a book is vaguely futuristic, it is sci-fi. This is honestly just a step further from space. Still not getting the whole picture, in my opinion. Does sci-fi deal with the future? Yes. I think that is goes into part of the definition that I want to talk about. Doesn't necessarily mean it's futuristic. Now let me tell you what I mean about this. Not all books take place many, many years in the future. Not all sci-fi works take place so many years in the future. You have, the way I term it is, you have short range, medium range, and long range sci-fi. The short range books explore in the next 5 to 10 years sometimes even more. But I think you could probably say that short range sci-fi exists where we're still on Earth, and we haven't really expanded to the rest of the solar system, is how I define it. Books like 1984, Infinite Jest, War of the Worlds, and then there's a lot of other very specific short stories that are that I've read that are very short range sci-fi. And a lot of these books wouldn't be considered sci-fi nowadays. They would be considered like historical fiction or something like that, because they're written about time periods that have already passed. Infinite Jest takes place somewhere around 2008, 2010-ish, roughly. And it literally takes place at a normal tennis academy. But also, Canada and Russia and America got into nuclear war, I think. And most of New England is a nuclear wasteland. But this was written in 1996. Now, nowadays it's classified as literary fiction, but I really do think it's basically... I've heard that it has been classified as sci-fi before, and I agree with that, because it was talking about the immediate future. 1984 is another good example, because it was written to be, hey, this is where we could go, but it's about a time that's already passed. I was reading another really short story in one of the, I think it's called The Many Worlds of Science Fiction. It doesn't have an ISBN number, it's just a compilation of a bunch of short stories that were in magazines. And there was a series of 3 short stories that were about an astronaut who committed the first murder in space. And this was written late 50s, early 60s, I believe. And this man goes up and he meets a Russian cosmonaut that was trying to sabotage his ship. So he kills him. And the last half, and that's the first short story. And the next 2 short stories deal with him mental things that he has to deal with hiding that, because the CIA tells him not to talk about it, and interacting with everybody around him with this secret of just like, I murdered a man and I watched him fly into space and I could do nothing. Like, this man watched this Russian dude still alive float off away from the earth. That's still a terrifying image. Just be like, hi, there's a human person who's alive right now, but because of where he is, he's dead. That's the mental trauma right there. But that was written in the 60s. And then another short story in this same collection was about, essentially, if you've ever seen Kids Next Door, like if that actually became a militant movement where all the kids banded together and were basically going to kill all the adults. There was no space. There was no futurism. It basically looked like it basically felt like it could happen tomorrow if all of these kids went all super militant Pied Piper stuff. That's sci-fi. But it's not futuristic. It's knocking at your door. Medium range sci-fi, I would say, is, I wouldn't put a year on it, but it's where we've colonized the solar system. Great example of this is The Expanse, where The Expanse, we've expanded to the belt, we've expanded to some of the outer planets, and we've developed societies there. So it deals with societal problems that are happening at the time. It deals with new interesting situations and how people would react to those situations. It's a really great series. But once we get beyond the solar system, once we get to galaxies, that's where I would term it as long-range sci-fi. Great example of this, of really long-range sci-fi, is Hyperion. There's some really interesting stuff and maybe some fantastical stuff that I'll revisit later. But it's, humans definitively came from Earth. And then they built this giant galactic society. Some of it splintered a little bit. And there's all these different interesting technological elements throughout it, all of which are plausible. And that is where you really get the futuristic label, is a lot of really long range sci-fi, because short range doesn't look futuristic at all most of the time and looks darn outdated sometimes. Other times medium range sci-fi hasn't reached the outdated part yet because we haven't really spread to the rest of the solar system, but it will get there. It seems a bit futuristic depending on what it is. The Expanse doesn't feel futuristic at all. It actually feels more grounded than a lot of other things, which is interesting. And then, of course, long-range sci-fi. So futuristic can apply to some things, but it doesn't monolithically apply to all of sci-fi. Frankenstein is another big example of this, because it's just, hi, this is how we think the human body works, and what if we decided to create life? It's a morality thing. And the very last thing that is probably the closest of all 3, but doesn't quite hit that mark because it's still needlessly reductive in my opinion, is science fiction is science. And where do I start? The main reason this one frustrates me is people will misclassify out. So for instance, Rhythm of War. There's science in that. Science involved with the magic. I think that's all I'm actually going to talk about with that. That's the extent of what I will tell you about. Rhythm of War, Book 4 in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. People called that a science fiction book because there was explorations of science related to the magic. This isn't them discovering the nuclear bomb or whatever, and something that's actually hard and fast science, but it's an application of certain scientific principles onto the magic. And people were like, oh, it's science fiction. And I'm like, no, it's still a fantasy for specific reasons that I will get to when I get to the fantasy part. And the reason I don't like this is because A, it tends to leave out soft sci-fi. And B, my frustration with Rhythm of War is you end up mislabeling things needlessly. Like these things may not actually touch on the main themes of sci-fi, which is literally thematically, how do people react? What's going to happen in the future? What's out there? Like, Rhythm of War doesn't touch into, oh my gosh, what are the societal implications of this? Not very much. Maybe a little bit, but that's definitely not the main focus of the book. No, this is one storyline in the book. Will some of their discoveries have a huge impact on the Cosmere as a whole because Brandon Sanderson? Yes, some pretty big discoveries were made in that book. But it is a function, the science is a function of the magic. Like, it's possible to have a scientific study of the magic without it being science fiction, because it's still magic. What if you're doing a really in-depth historical fiction about the Manhattan Project? Is that automatically sci-fi? No. Creation of a jet engine. Is it automatically sci-fi because you're delving into science? No. If it's a random fantasy that delves into science, I would honestly look at what the intent of the author was. Specifically, an example that comes to mind is Dragon Riders of Pern. At first glance, the marketing world would say that's fantasy. But the author specifically was like, no, this is sci-fi because everything is technologically based. Everything is, hey, we came from Earth and we're colonized this planet and years of things. And yeah, that's just how Dragons and Riders of Pern is. Everything is essentially somewhat scientifically based. Dragons breathe fire because of XYZ. They have a second stomach and some other stuff. And it's years and years of breeding dragons to actually do this. So intent of the author is important here. With the exception of Terry Goodkind, because he didn't know what he's talking about. He's literally just an arrogant dude saying he doesn't write fantasy when he definitely writes fantasy. Specifically, if you look at the intent of the author and you see that it's like, this is a possible future civilization intent. I think that's really the defining thing, and that touches on what I think sci-fi actually is. But this term that science makes sci-fi, also with it leaving behind soft sci-fi, soft science sci-fi, such as, let's go back to War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. We have aliens coming from space and shooting things up. We don't get science in that book. We get terror. We get humans reacting to an unfamiliar situation and being like, holy crap, what do we do? We just follow a guy going through a war zone. The Martians are just trying to kill everybody, evidently. But we don't get actually like, oh, this is what the aliens are like. This is how their ships work. There isn't hard science. And this kind of like, this concept that it's not just science jives with what Isaac Asimov says. Science fiction can be classified as a branch of literature which deals with the reaction of people to changes in science and technology. So science is there, but it's not monolithically defined by the presence of it. Because there can be soft sci-fi, there can be hard sci-fi. Soft sci-fi actually tends to focus on more like sociological changes, whereas hard sci-fi tends to deal with actual science that people are like, oh, this science. And I would specifically say that it deals with changes to our world, our timeline, so to speak. Because that's really one consistently thing that I see throughout a lot of sci-fi is they're either based off of our world or they could plausibly considered based off of our world. And I say plausibly very vaguely because that's where things get a little bit fuzzy. So my, I guess, definition of sci-fi is a branch of literature that deals with changes to the world, changes to science and technology, and future situations in our world specifically. And this will be important when we get to fantasy because it's kind of delineating a line there. Science fiction is about exploring concepts and exploring the consequences and the results of all of these things, whether they be good, whether they be bad, whether it be, I don't know. I would say that science fiction is supposed to be human, but older science fiction is also known for having really bland characters, which is ironic because I see the potential for sci-fi to be basically one of the most human of all literature because it deals with what are we going to do. Now, with everything, there are rule breakers and line benders or whatever you want to call them. Let's talk about some subgenres. One particular one that I think kind of branches out from sci-fi is alternative history. Alternative history tends to be very, very close to sci-fi thematically, in my opinion, because it also deals with what if this change happened, how would the world be different? And those can go into short or long-range sci-fi. They can even be considered sci-fi if they are farther in the future. Another one would be steampunk, which is also kind of almost a love child between sci-fi and alternative history. It started out as something where it's like, okay, what if oil wasn't a thing and we just had the steam engine and the Victorian era of technology kind of continued? And thus we have the steampunk vibe that we have today, because it started out as a genre and now it's definitely more of an aesthetic, or has evolved into an aesthetic. So now it's not necessarily purely alternative history, but to a certain extent it like blends into fantasy quite nicely, just using that specific level of technology. So that is one that definitely crosses the line between fantasy and sci-fi frequently. So what is fantasy, now that we've gotten over with sci-fi? And I think I'm not going to tease you as much with the definition, but I think the main definition that I have of fantasy is it doesn't take place in our timeline. And that's a really wide scope. One of the defining features of fantasy is magic. So I would say it is more along the lines of, it is a book that is in a fictional universe, not our own, that has altered rules, where the science of our universe does not jive with the science of theirs, where there are different things, whether it's giant lizards flying when theoretically they would be unable to fly based on physics, or whether there's people that can move things with their minds, or people that can create fireballs out of just, a pile of bat crap and some magical Macarena stuff. That doesn't fit with science. That doesn't fit with how the universe works. But it does fit in fantasy because the rules are different. So, let's talk about one of the arguments about magic. One of the things about magic, this is probably the most ranty you might get, and I'm still kind of like re-recording this, so I'm not like super, I don't feel like I don't want to sound super condescending or confrontational with this, but this is something that kind of grinds my gears. And there's a quote that people use to justify this. Essentially, the argument is that all science is magic and all magic is science. And they use the quote to justify it, and completely just like, no, it's not what it says. The quote by Arthur C. Clarke is, "Any sufficiently advanced science or technology is indistinguishable from magic. This means magic is science and science is magic." And that's not what the quote means. In fact, you're taking a meaning from the quote that is the opposite of what the quote says. So it says that, hey, if you have a little person here that's at a certain level of technology, and then you have another group of people up here that have a lot more understanding of how the world works, and they do a lot more things. Say they can teleport. And then this group up here, like, teleports back and forth. And the person down here sees it like, whoa. The person down here will not be able to tell if this is magic or just science. Like, if this is going to be a soft magic, like, I don't understand, but it's a mystical power thing. This force that is not normal. Or it's just like, oh, this is just an application of how the world works. It does not say that all magic is science or all magic is technology. It says that a certain person will not be able to tell the difference between the two. And that's a story element. Like, you could have, theoretically, multiple different, like, peoples in a story where one of them thinks, oh, they're magic. And the other one's like, nah, dude, this is just technology. It doesn't say that automatically all magic is technology, which it isn't. Because that would also say that if you look at the scale of hard magic to soft magic, eventually you get such hard magic that it kind of just falls off the scale and goes into sci-fi, which that's not a thing. And that's why part of this quote is part of the reason why I structured my definitions the way I did, was because I really don't like it when people use this quote. Like, I'm sorry if you use this quote, but like, it's just a frustrating quote for me. What is magic? Let's talk about this. Like, this is why I have this definition for magic as well. Magic is a force, or whether it be natural or otherwise, a force or something along those lines, that does not exist in our real world, in our reality here on Earth, in Universe 1, whatever you want to call it, this world reality. It is a force that does not exist within it. Classic example, the Force from Star Wars. That is not a natural thing that we can do. People can't use the Force and move things with their minds or convince people with the wave of a hand unless their mind is too strong. They can't shoot lightning out of their hands based on the will of whatever. Dark side, light side. This is not natural to our Earth. It may be a representation of a philosophy that Lucas used, but it is not an actual force that exists. The wit and the skill in Realm of the Outerlings, the two magic systems, those don't exist here on Earth. Like, we can't connect with the minds of animals. I mean, there may be tales and mythologies about that, but it doesn't exist here to our knowledge. Aragon with storing energy into gems and like commanding things with your words and just commanding fire to appear by just saying fire in an ancient language. Nope. Doesn't exist. Stormlight from the Stormlight Archive. You don't just like suck something in from a gem and all of a sudden you can fly. Sort of. That doesn't exist. That's why it's magic. And so this kind of transcends the boundary between hard and soft magic, because one thing that I've heard said is that once you start defining magic and you start making it a hard magic system, essentially, you start saying this is how it works, and then this is how it interacts with light, and then it affects sound this way as well, and time this way, and start just really defining it a lot, and even to the point of measuring, this many flakes of metal will give me this much iron pole or whatever. Some people will say the phrase, this takes the magic out of magic, so it's not magic anymore, it's science. And this is an argument that prompted me to define magic how I define it above, because it's still magic because it is a force. What they are talking about is what I would say is the property of being magical, which is something that soft magic excels at. Soft magic is an emotional connection to the reader. Soft magic is a tool used by the writer, whereas hard magic is a tool used by the character to solve problems. Soft magic is there to evoke an emotion, whether it's fear, terror, wonder is the biggest one. Just that feeling of magicalness of like, that's cool. I don't know how it works, but that's cool. That's soft magic. Whereas hard magic is more designed so that characters can explore different solutions to the problem. If my enemy is 20 feet away and I have a stake, but I have magical telekinesis, I don't have to throw the stake. I can use telekinesis to get it to the enemy's heart. And that's something that would be foreshadowed and all that other jazz. It solves a problem that I have in a unique way. And there's a lot of different ways that this can be used, of course. But the key to fantasy really is just it not being here in this universe. And you might say, what about Hogwarts? What about Dresden? What about all these things that take place here on Earth? And yeah, those are fantasy. Those are low fantasy. They take place in a world that is like Earth, but is not specifically Earth because the rules are different. Harry Potter magic does not work. I don't know if you've tried it recently. You might call yourself a muggle, but witches and wizards, like they are in Harry Potter, don't exist. There are definitely things that people believe, such as whether it's Ouija boards, whether it's tarot cards, whether it's other stuff. People believe that certain types of magic exist in this real world. But I don't think that takes away from magic and fantasy being its own separate thing and saying that this is how it works and that this is a separate thing from our world. And if you are one of those people that is like a Hogwarts conspiracy theorist that thinks that Hogwarts actually exists on this earth, have you heard of pig farts? It's another school, a magical school, a very elite magical school. You have to take a rocket to go see it. Go look it up, it's cool. Anyways, subgenres. I mean, I kind of started talking to what I was talking about, subgenres, because I was talking about low fantasy and urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is like, hey, it takes place in a city, like Dresden, and it's a city, and it's our world. Again, that kind of like goes into the whole, like, hey, this isn't... it looks like an exception to the rule, but it's really not, because it's really not our world, because the rules are different. Another one could be Flintlock fantasy. This was one that kind of like borders up onto steampunk, because there's technological explorations. I say this one, Flintlock, really belongs firmly in fantasy because it's mostly historical based more than anything. Yes, there may be technological explorations, but it's like old stuff, honestly. Like it's not exploring anything that's in the future that we don't know how people react to it. You can literally read a history book. For instance, the Shadow Campaigns and Powder Major Trilogy, they both have magic to different extents. Like one is very soft and one has both hard and soft technically. Sanderson v something else. Martin, maybe? But they're both objectively in a world that is not our world and has different rules. Another one you might say, like, once you get into really long-range sci-fi, these rules start to bend. Hyperion, for example. Really, really long-range, sci-fi is crazy because you get, hi, I'm going to step to another planet through a portal, and all this other stuff that's like, this might be theoretically possible, but it's highly unlikely. It's science, right? But it's very soft science, especially in Hyperion. And it turns out to be like, okay, is this about what is out there or just playing around with these things? And to me, Hyperion really speaks to, of course, the crazy things that could be out in the world and the crazy things that we as humans could create based on what is out there. Like, the Shrike is definitely not a thing that we would make unless I could be mistaken. I've only read the first one, but like, it feels to me like a very much an alien entity and an exploration of our interactions with it over time. And some of it might seem magical for certain, but I would definitely classify Hyperion as a sci-fi with fantastical influence, not necessarily a fantasy. Definitely not a pure fantasy, or maybe not even a pure sci-fi book. But really, when you get down to it, fantasy is there to provide authors a way to bend the rules and just completely do away with all the rules. Because you can make a fantasy world what you want. So you can make a fantasy world to create these situations and to tell a story that would not otherwise be possible in our world. Because I think there are plenty out there that are like that. Stormlight Archive is one of them. Robin Hobb, that's another pretty specific example with like the Farseer trilogy. Freaking Star Wars. Like Star Wars, I'll get into that in a minute, but like arguably should be classified as fantasy. Malazan, like there's so many explorations that if you did this in a normal world, in our world, it wouldn't hit the same. And there's so many things in Malazan that are uniquely fantasy, like hardcore fantasy stuff, that you can't replicate in the real world. And you wouldn't be able to communicate the same way. Now, genre benders. Let's talk about some genre benders. Because, like, as always, there are things that are different, that like, try to break these rules. I think the one that I'm really going to talk about is Star Wars. Contextually, there might be a lot of sci-fi elements in Star Wars. Just, for instance, the fact that they have ethereal rudders, which is something that is explored in the book. Star Wars ships don't follow what we would think physics actually looks like in space, because they connect to the ether and they drive through that instead of actually like shooting instead of other plausible theories that people have for how space travel would work in such a thing. Additionally, Star Wars does not take place in our universe, despite the whole long time ago in a galaxy far, far away line. And the rules are super different. Like, the Force is a thing. The Force is not a thing that exists here, as I said before. Like, it's a magic system. Jedi are space wizards. It's arguably primarily a fantasy with sci-fi influence, because it's about breaking free from the rules of our universe rather than exploring the implications of specific pieces of either science, technology, or just how society works. Because this video is long enough, I'm going to, stop it there. Let me know what you thought of your thoughts. If there's any fantasy or sci-fi books that you think bend the lines, let me know. I'd really be interested to hear about them, because this is a work in progress. This is a long video, and I understand it's a long video, and I appreciate you staying the entire time if you have. So, yeah, thank you. I'm always looking to learn. I'm always looking to just expand my perception. Expand my perception of just what literature is, because this is something that has evolved over many years and reading a lot of books. But there are so many more books that I haven't read, like an infinite number of other books that I haven't read. I mean, I wouldn't even say I'm close to being as well read as most of the people here on BookTube, in my personal opinion. So, thank you so much again. If you have a comment for me, just leave it down below and we'll talk. I've said thank you like a billion times, but again, you're awesome. Make sure to get some rest. Have a great night.